Doctors said it was just a bark, but a German shepherd proved them wrong. It was just past 2 a.m. when the silence shattered. Ranger, an old German shepherd lying in the corner of the ICU, sprang to his feet and barked at Sophie Morales' hospital bed with a force that startled the nurses awake. The alarms stayed quiet. The monitors showed nothing. To the staff, it was nothing more than a disturbance. But Daniel Hayes, the ex-lieutenant who had trained Ranger for years, saw something different. Just before the bark, Sophie's chest had lifted, a breath small but deeper than any in weeks. The machines hadn't caught it. The staff didn't believe it, but Ranger had. From that moment forward, Ranger's every movement became a signal, a tilt of his head, a stiffening of his tail, a whine at midnight. And though skeptics called it coincidence, Sophie's parents began to realize what Daniel already knew. Their daughter was still fighting, and the dog no one trusted had been listening all along. This is the story of a shepherd who defied science, a girl who refused to let go, and the moment a bark became the first whisper of life returning. The desert outside did not sleep. Even at midnight, New Mexico's summer heat clung to the earth like a punishment, air shimmering above the asphalt, stone walls still radiating the day's fire. Beyond the hospital gates, cicadas shrilled in the mesquite trees, their voices rising and falling like a chorus that belonged to another world. Inside Sierra Vista Children's Hospital, that world was shut out. Here, air conditioners hummed relentlessly, fighting to erase any trace of the furnace beyond. The walls were pale and sterile, the floors polished to a mirror-like sheen. Yet the ICU was no sanctuary. It was colder than the desert, in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. Room 12 stood at the far end of the pediatric wing, its door half closed, a narrow strip of light spilling into the hall. Machines breathed in steady rhythm, their beeps and hums the only signs of time passing. And in the center of it all lay a child, small, fragile, wrapped in wires that looked too heavy for her body. Sophie Morales was only 8 years old, but the accident had stolen the softness of childhood from her face. Beneath the nest of tubes and adhesive patches, her cheeks were hollow, her lips pale, her eyelids refusing to lift. She had been here for weeks now, her body held in place by technology that mimicked what she no longer could. Beside her, 2 chairs told the story of her parents' vigil. One was occupied by Miguel Morales, a man in his late 30s whose hands still carried the stains of his work as a carpenter. Those hands, calloused and rough, now seemed strangely gentle as they wrapped around Sophie's small fingers. He sat hunched, eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, staring at the slow rise and fall of her chest, as though sheer will might coax her back. The second chair was empty, a blanket folded neatly across its armrest. Elena, Sophie's mother, had stepped into the hall minutes earlier, too drained to sit any longer. She carried with her the faint scent of old library paper. She'd been a teacher before this nightmare began, and the weariness of a woman who had run out of tears, but not of love. In the hall she walked, back and forth, whispering prayers under her breath, each one fragile as the next. Together, Miguel and Elena lived in shifts, their lives reduced to cycles of waiting. One sat beside the bed, clutching hope with trembling fingers. The other drifted down hallways, seeking air, or closed their eyes briefly in the family lounge, only to wake to the same heavy silence. They were no longer husband and wife in those moments, not even individuals. They were keepers of Sophie's time, guardians of her still body, watchers who had forgotten how to rest. The ICU staff moved in and out with quiet efficiency, their shoes making no sound on the waxed floor. To them, this was routine. Tubes, wires, a child in coma. Painful, yes, but not rare. They read numbers on monitors, adjusted IV bags, replaced worn tape. They did their jobs, but their eyes avoided Sophie's parents when possible. Despair was contagious, and they carried enough of it already. Miguel felt the weight of that silence most at night. During the day, the hospital buzzed with life. Doctors' footsteps, pages called overhead, phones ringing, the clatter of trays. But at night, when the hallways emptied and the world shrank to the soft hiss of machines, the stillness was unbearable. Every small sound magnified. The click of Sophie's ventilator, the shuffle of a nurse's papers, the sigh he didn't mean to release. He remembered the crash too vividly, the scream of tires on asphalt, the way the car had spun, lights twisting into chaos. Sophie's small voice cut off by the shatter of glass. Every time he closed his eyes, it returned, cruel and merciless, telling him that it was his fault. He'd let her ride that night, let her be in that car when he could have said no. That guilt pressed against him now, like a second heartbeat. Elena's grief was different. She clung to rituals, reading aloud Sophie's favorite stories, even when Sophie could not hear, humming lullabies in the hope they might slip into her dreams. She rearranged the flowers in the corner vase daily, as though order could keep despair away. To her, silence was not emptiness, but a call to fill it with memory, with reminders that Sophie had been alive, vibrant, laughing once. The hospital itself seemed indifferent. Its walls absorbed their sorrow. Its machines ignored their whispered pleas. And in that place where minutes stretched like hours, where nothing changed, despair became routine. It was a silence that wasn't peaceful, but heavy, like a weight pressing down, daring them to keep breathing when Sophie could not. Nurses came and went, adjusting, noting, departing. None of them looked twice at the empty corner of the room, the one space not occupied by machine or parent. It was just a square of tile, sterile like the rest. But in the days to come, it would no longer be empty. That space was waiting, for the weight of pause, for the gaze of eyes that saw differently, for a presence that would change everything. For now, though, it was only Miguel's hand holding Sophie's, Elena's footsteps pacing the hall, and the endless, mechanical rhythm of machines pretending to be a heartbeat. Outside, the desert sweltered. Inside, the ICU froze. And between them lay an 8-year-old girl, silent, suspended in a fragile space between life and death. The automatic doors at Sierra Vista slid open with a sigh, letting in a blast of desert air before closing tight again. Daniel Hayes paused in the entryway, one hand resting lightly on the harness of the German shepherd beside him. The heat still clung to his shirt, but inside the hospital, the cold bit at his skin. It was a contrast he had grown used to. The world outside burned with chaos and noise, while hospitals always seemed to hum with a quieter kind of battle. Ranger padded at his side, steps measured, claws clicking faintly against the tile. Age had silvered the fur around his muzzle, but his posture remained proud, eyes steady, ears flicking with the alertness of an animal who had never truly left the field. Years earlier, in the rubble of collapsed buildings, Ranger had been a legend, known for finding breath where no one thought breath could be. Daniel had trusted him with lives then. Now, here, he was trusting him with something more fragile. Belief. Daniel himself carried the kind of bearing that never fully left a soldier. Shoulders squared, back straight, but with a heaviness around the eyes that spoke of battles fought both outwardly and inwardly. Once a lieutenant in the army, he had left the service after losing too many men and after watching too many children pulled from ruins with no one to comfort them. Ranger had been his partner in those dark days, crawling through dust, sniffing out hope. It was that memory, the way Ranger once pressed his nose against a slab of concrete and then pawed furiously until rescuers pulled a 6-year-old boy free, that had planted the seed of this program. Therapy dogs weren't new, but dogs like Ranger, trained to recognize life itself in the faintest flicker, were rare. Daniel believed they could bridge the distance between medicine and instinct. Yet as he walked into the ICU ward with Ranger at heel, he could feel the eyes. Nurses slowed as they passed. A doctor pausing mid-step, eyebrows lifted. To them, this was symbolic at best, a distraction at worst. An old dog in an ICU wasn't science. It was sentiment. "Lieutenant Hayes?" A nurse at the station glanced at her clipboard, then at the shepherd. "You're here for the pilot case?" Daniel nodded, tightening his grip on the harness. "Yes. This is Ranger." Her gaze flicked down, scanning the gray hairs on Ranger's muzzle, the scars across his flank. "He looks older than I expected." "He's earned every year," Daniel replied evenly. But inside his chest a familiar knot pulled tight. Doubt was something he had lived with since he proposed the project. He could stand in front of committees, present data, cite studies. But the moment they saw Ranger, saw an animal instead of the countless lives he had touched, skepticism always filled the air. They led him down the corridor. Each step echoed, Ranger moving in silent synchrony, his head turning just slightly at the scent of disinfectant, the faint beep of a monitor, the chemical tang of alcohol wipes. The ICU smelled nothing like the dust and earth he once worked in. But Ranger's nose catalogued it all, as if filing away the terrain of a new battlefield. They stopped outside room 12. The nurse gestured. "Your patient." Her tone carried the neutrality of someone withholding judgment, but her eyes said, "This is pointless." Daniel pushed the door open quietly. The cold struck him first, the artificial chill that machines required. Then the sight of Sophie Morales. She was so small. The bed dwarfed her, wires trailing from every direction like roots from a fragile tree. A ventilator hissed at her side, feeding her lungs the rhythm her body could no longer manage on its own. In the corner, Miguel Morales sat hunched over, his hand wrapped around his daughter's. He looked up, eyes narrowing at the sight of the shepherd. There was no hostility, only exhaustion, and the faint spark of a man who no longer had the energy to believe in anything new. Elena returned from the hall a moment later, clutching a book to her chest. She froze when she saw Ranger, lips parting as if to protest, then closing again. Words had long since lost their power here. Daniel cleared his throat gently. "This is Ranger. He'll be part of Sophie's care." Neither parent responded. Miguel's thumb kept moving in small circles against Sophie's hand, as though that motion alone tethered her to the world. Elena lowered herself into the chair and opened the book, her voice barely above a whisper as she began to read. The Ranger didn't move closer. He stood at Daniel's side, ears twitching, eyes fixed on the bed. Daniel studied him carefully, every muscle, every breath. In the past, Ranger's stillness meant concentration, the moment before he made a decision. But now, it could just as easily be hesitation or indifference. Behind him, voices murmured in the hall, nurses whispering. One said, "It's sweet, but this isn't going to change anything." Another replied, "We'll see. Maybe it helps the parents, if nothing else." Their words weren't cruel, but they carried the same weight Daniel had heard too many times. A nice gesture, not real medicine. Daniel exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to relax. He knew the odds. He knew the risk. This wasn't just about Sophie. This was about proving something larger. That instinct, when honed, could detect what monitors missed. That maybe, just maybe, dogs like Ranger weren't finished saving lives. He placed a hand on Ranger's harness, leaning down close. "This is your moment, old boy," he whispered, low enough that only Ranger might hear. The shepherd flicked his ears, eyes steady on the child in the bed, but made no sound. To anyone else, it looked like nothing. Just an old dog in a hospital room, waiting politely while his handler scribbled notes. To Daniel, it was the beginning of the trial that could either vindicate every sacrifice he'd made, or crush the last hope he carried. For now, the room remained unchanged. Sophie lay silent, machines humming. Her parents clung to their vigil. And in the corner of the sterile ICU, Ranger's presence lingered like a quiet question. No one yet knew how to answer. The first time Ranger set paw inside room 12, the hush seemed to grow heavier, as though even the machines held their breath. Daniel loosened his grip on the harness and gave the quiet command. Ranger stepped forward, his gait steady, measured, ears flicking at the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. For a brief moment, Daniel thought he might see what he had seen so many times before. That subtle shift, that instinctual pull toward life. But as Ranger reached the edge of the bed, he stopped. The shepherd stood motionless, eyes locked on Sophie's small form, beneath the tangle of wires and tubes. The little girl's chest rose and fell, shallow, fragile, tethered to the machine that breathed for her. Ranger's nose twitched, once, twice, as though tasting the air. Then, without warning, he turned. Daniel's heart sank as Ranger padded deliberately toward the corner of the room, circled once on the sterile tile, and lowered himself with a grunt. His body curled into stillness, head resting on his paws, eyes fixed not on Sophie, but on some invisible point beyond. The silence that followed wasn't reverent. It was skeptical. A nurse adjusting Sophie's IV let out the faintest sigh. Another, carrying a clipboard, raised her brows and muttered under her breath, "I told you, it's not going to work." The words were quiet, but Daniel heard them all the same. He felt the sting, like a blade sliding between his ribs. He kept his face neutral, his back straight, but his pen tightened in his hand as he forced himself to take notes. Entry 1. Ranger remains in observation position, no engagement with patient. To Miguel, sitting at the bedside, it looked like confirmation of what he'd already believed. An animal couldn't reach his daughter, when even doctors couldn't. He barely spared the shepherd a glance, his gaze rooted to Sophie's fingers in his own. Elena, too, barely acknowledged the dog. She opened her book again, her lips forming the familiar words of a fairy tale. Her voice trembled, not because of belief, but because of exhaustion. The presence of a dog in the room seemed no more significant than the flowers wilting in the corner. Daniel felt the weight of their doubt pressing against him, heavier than the chill of the room. He knew the staff were watching, that every movement, or lack thereof, was being judged. To them, Ranger lying motionless in the corner was failure before the experiment had even begun. But Daniel looked closer. He had lived with this dog through the roar of collapsed buildings, through nights where the only light came from fires, smoldering in ruins. He had learned that Ranger's stillness wasn't always disinterest. Sometimes it was calculation. Sometimes it was the pause before revelation. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, crouching down briefly, as if the words were meant for both of them. Ranger flicked an ear, but didn't rise. His amber eyes stayed locked forward, unblinking. The nurses whispered again as they left the room. "It's sweet for the family," one said, "but it won't change anything." Their shoes squeaked softly on the polished floor as they disappeared down the hall. Daniel forced himself to keep writing. Note: patient remains unresponsive. Ranger stationary. Observation only. No direct engagement. The words looked clinical, but beneath them pulsed disappointment he dared not show. He closed the notebook gently and slid it back into his pocket, then leaned against the wall, watching. He knew the others saw an old dog lying useless in a corner. What he saw was a partner whose silence had once preceded miracles. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He had staked years of his life on this moment, on this dog. And now, with parents waiting for answers and staff ready to dismiss the trial, he felt the weight of expectation press down like the desert heat outside. The night stretched on. Elena's voice faded to a hum. Miguel's head dipped forward as he dozed, his hand never leaving his daughter's. Sophie lay silent, her body as unmoving as the shepherd who kept watch from across the room. And Daniel, ex-soldier, dreamer, believer, sat with his notes open, staring at the blank spaces between words, wondering if faith alone could carry them through the silence. For now, that was all there was. A child lost in a coma. A father too weary to hope. A mother whispering stories into the void. And a shepherd in the corner, eyes fixed on something no one else could yet see. The first contact had not come, at least not in the way anyone expected. The night pressed against the windows of Sierra Vista like a weight, the desert darkness broken only by the neon glow of the hospital sign humming outside. Inside room 12, where the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wilted carnations, Miguel Morales sat as he had sat every night for nearly a month, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, his rough carpenter's hands wrapped around the small fingers of his daughter. Sophie's hand was pale, almost translucent, threaded with the bluish lines of veins. His own was the opposite, darkened by sun, lined with years of labor, calloused from holding hammers, saws, sandpaper. Hands that had built furniture for neighbors, cradled Elena in younger days, carried Sophie when she was a toddler. Hands made for strength. And yet, as he cradled hers now, they felt powerless. The machines continued their indifferent rhythm, pumping, beeping, ticking off the seconds like a clock no one could stop. Miguel hated their sound. They mocked him. To others, they were proof of life. To him, they were reminders that his daughter's heart didn't beat on its own. Her lungs didn't rise without help. He longed for the simple sound of her breath filling a room, the laughter that used to bounce down their hallway at home. He closed his eyes, and the memory came back with cruel clarity. The night of the accident, the shriek of tires on Route 86, the jolt that knocked the air out of him, the shattering glass, and Sophie's voice, so small in the back seat, cut off mid-word. He could still hear Eleanor screaming her name. Could still feel the metallic taste of fear in his mouth as he turned and saw his daughter slumped, her doll slipping from her hands. He had been the one who said yes. Yes, she could ride with him that night. Yes, they could take the highway, even though the storm clouds were low and the road slick. Yes, she could bring the doll she never let go of. He had been the adult, the father, the protector. And still, here she was, silent, fragile, held to the world only by wires, and the quiet hum of strangers' machines. His chest tightened until he had to bite down to keep the sound inside. He would not cry again, not tonight. Tears had done nothing. From the corner, a faint shift. Miguel glanced sideways. Ranger lay curled against the wall, his head on his paws, golden eyes faintly visible in the dim light. The shepherd had barely moved since Daniel brought him in. Miguel hadn't objected. What was the point? If doctors and medicine couldn't wake Sophie, how could a dog? Still, he noticed the way Ranger's ears twitched, subtle, almost imperceptible, like he was catching sounds no one else could hear. Maybe it was the hiss of the ventilator, maybe just the night settling around them. But those small movements made Miguel uneasy. The dog didn't blink much, didn't pant. He just watched. "Do you see something I don't?" Miguel whispered hoarsely, his voice nearly lost in the mechanical rhythm of the machines. Ranger didn't stir, didn't answer. Of course he didn't. He was only a dog. Miguel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. A water stain spread like a ghost above the fluorescent lights, the kind of blemish that hospitals never seem to fix. He remembered how Sophie used to lie on her back in the yard, pointing out shapes in the clouds. "That one's a horse, Papa. That one's a castle." He used to laugh, pretending he saw them too. Now he stared at the stain, wishing with all his strength that Sophie could lift her finger, find a shape, tell him a story again. His grip tightened on her hand. He whispered in Spanish, voice breaking. "Mi pequeña. I should have said no. I should have kept you safe. Forgive me, Sophie. Please, forgive me." The words hung in the air, unanswered, swallowed by the steady pulse of the monitor. He waited, foolishly, for a twitch, a squeeze, anything. Nothing came. Ranger's tail gave a slow flick against the floor, a sound so soft, Miguel almost missed it. He turned his head, caught those amber eyes, still fixed in Sophie's direction. The dog didn't move otherwise, but the gaze was steady, unshakable. Miguel looked away quickly, uncomfortable under it. "I don't need your pity," he muttered, half to himself. "Not from you, not from anyone." But the truth was, some part of him envied the shepherd's patience. The dog didn't fidget, didn't pace, didn't whisper apologies into the void. He just stayed silent, watching, as though waiting for something only he knew. Hours slipped by that way. Elena eventually drifted back into the room, laid her hand on Miguel's shoulder, and whispered that he should rest. He shook his head. His place was here. His punishment was here. He could not leave Sophie's side. She sat in the second chair, opening a book, her voice soft as she began to read aloud. Miguel barely heard the words. His focus stayed on his daughter's still hand in his own, on the faintest warmth left in her skin. The ranger didn't move. Only his ears twitched, again and again, as though catching whispers too faint for human ears. And Miguel, broken and weary, sat through the long hours of the night, lost between memory and guilt, waiting for a sign that never seemed to come. The clock above the door ticked softly, though in the stillness of the ICU, even that sound felt intrusive. Elena Morales sat with her back straight in the vinyl chair, the edges of her shawl slipping from her shoulders. In her lap rested a worn children's book, the cover frayed from years of bedtime rituals. Sophie had insisted on this one more than any other. The Girl and the Silver Bird, a fairy tale about a child who wandered into the forest and was guided home by a bird that sang only at night. Eleanor smoothed the page with trembling fingers. Her voice rose, soft at first, barely more than a whisper against the steady rhythm of the ventilator. And when the little girl grew afraid of the dark woods, she closed her eyes and listened for the silver bird's song. She knew if she followed it, she would never be lost. The words faltered. She swallowed hard, tried again, her throat dry from reading for hours on end. Sometimes she chose fairy tales. Sometimes the dinosaur encyclopedias Sophie had once carried everywhere, pages marked with sticky notes of her favorite species. Other nights it was lullabies, sung through the rasp of exhaustion. It didn't matter what the story was. What mattered was that her daughter's world hadn't gone silent. Elena leaned closer to the bed, her hand hovering above Sophie's arm, careful not to disturb the wires and tubes. "I'm still here, mi amor," she whispered, "and I'll keep reading until you wake up. You remember the bird, don't you? The one who sang only when the stars were out. That's me now. I'll keep singing, even if it's dark." Her voice cracked on the last word. She shut the book, pressing it against her chest as though holding it tighter might keep her from breaking. The quiet pressed back at her, cruel and unrelenting. Sophie's eyelids didn't flutter. Her fingers didn't twitch. The monitors blinked with their indifferent rhythm. From the corner came the faint scrape of claws against tile. Elena turned her head, startled, then frowned. Ranger hadn't moved more than a few feet since he was brought into the room. He lay stretched out, muzzle resting on his paws, eyes open but unblinking, gaze fixed somewhere between Sophie and the floor. To Elena, it looked like indifference. She let out a weary, humorless laugh. "So this is the miracle they promised?" Her voice was low, edged with bitterness. "A dog that lies down and does nothing." Her words weren't meant to be cruel, just tired. So desperately, utterly tired. Ranger didn't stir. Only his ears twitched once at the sound of her voice, then stilled again. Elena shook her head and looked back at her daughter. "Why bring him here?" she asked, almost to herself, almost to the silent machines. If love couldn't wake her, why would a dog? Her voice trembled again. She reached for Sophie's hand, so small in hers, and clung to it. "You used to tell me stories too," she murmured. "Remember? About your dinosaurs. About how the Triceratops would protect its babies no matter what. You made me promise I'd never leave you behind, even if the T-Rex came." Her lips quivered into a fragile smile. "And now look at me. I can't even keep the darkness away." Her shoulders slumped as she bent over, pressing her forehead to the side of Sophie's bed. The book slipped from her lap, pages fluttering against the floor. Behind her, Ranger lifted his head slightly, ears twitching, eyes never leaving Sophie. To anyone else, it still looked like stillness. But Elena, turning back, saw only distance. "He doesn't even care," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Not about her. Not about us." Her words carried the sting of hopelessness, but also the fragile ache of a mother who had run out of places to direct her pain. If Daniel had been there, he might have told her the shepherd's silence was not emptiness, but attention, that Ranger was listening in ways no one else could. But in that moment, all she saw was another presence in the room, failing to save her child. The silence pressed down again, thick and suffocating. Elena picked the book up from the floor, brushing the pages clean, and began to read once more. Her voice was softer now, barely audible above the machines. And the girl knew, even in the darkness, she wasn't alone. The silver bird was there, even if she couldn't hear its song yet. She closed her eyes, fighting the burn of exhaustion. If Sophie was out there somewhere, lost in a forest of dreams, Elena prayed her words would be the song that guided her back. In the corner, Ranger lay motionless, amber eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, ears twitching once more. The machines hummed. The mother read, the child slept, and the shepherd kept his silent vigil. The conference room smelled faintly of burned coffee and disinfectant, a scent that clung to nearly every corner of Sierra Vista Hospital. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their white glare giving everything an unnatural sharpness. Daniel Hayes sat at the end of the long table, a leather notebook open in front of him, though his pen had not moved in several minutes. Ranger wasn't with him this time. Hospital policy kept the dog from these kinds of meetings. Without the shepherd at his side, Daniel felt strangely incomplete, like a soldier stripped of his weapon. Dr. Ramirez, the ICU chief, sat directly across from him, fingers steepled, her expression unreadable. Around her were 3 attending physicians and 2 senior nurses. Their scrubs and lab coats carried the quiet authority of people used to dealing in numbers, charts, and the clean lines of data. Daniel, in contrast, felt like an intruder from another world, one built on instinct, mud, and memory. "Lieutenant Hayes," Dr. Ramirez began, her tone clipped but not unkind. "We've given your program a fair chance these past days, but frankly, we're not seeing measurable results. Ranger hasn't engaged with the patient. He lies in the corner, unresponsive. It's hard to justify continuing." The words settled like stones in Daniel's chest. He leaned forward slightly, forcing calm into his voice. "With respect, Doctor, stillness isn't the same as failure. Ranger observes before he acts. Always has." One of the younger doctors adjusted his glasses. "This isn't a collapsed building. This is an ICU. We don't need a dog to watch. We have monitors, EEGs, pulse oximeters. Machines don't get tired." The nurse beside him added quietly, "And the family doesn't need false hope." Daniel felt heat rising in his neck. He wanted to slam his fist down, to tell them they didn't understand, but he had learned long ago that conviction needed restraint to be heard. He opened his notebook, flipped through the careful notes he'd made, entries about Ranger's posture, the twitch of his ears, the way his gaze never left the child. To him, they meant everything. To them, they were just scribbles. "Let me tell you something," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Kabul, 2012. A 7-story apartment block collapsed after a bomb. 20 people were trapped beneath rubble. Machines couldn't detect movement that deep. But Ranger?" He paused, swallowing against the knot in his throat as the memory surged. "Ranger crawled through gaps so small I couldn't follow. He pawed at a pile of concrete until his pads bled. We dug where he told us, found 4 survivors, 4 human lives, buried and fading. He pulled them back from death with nothing but instinct." The room was quiet. The younger doctor cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Dr. Ramirez, however, met Daniel's eyes and held them. "That was a different battlefield," she said softly. "And perhaps your dog was trained for that battlefield. But this," she gestured toward the glass window that looked into the ICU wing where Sophie Morales lay motionless. "This is not rubble. This is a child, and we cannot risk the dignity of her care for a program that may be nothing more than sentiment." Her words cut deeper than she intended. Daniel straightened, jaw tight. Sentiment. That was what they always said, wasn't it? Committees, donors, administrators. They didn't see what he had seen. Ranger pressing his nose against a heartbeat beneath steel, ears pricking at a gasp no one else heard. He thought of Sophie's father, Miguel, holding his daughter's fragile hand with those scarred carpenter's fingers. Thought of Elena, reading until her voice broke. They didn't need more machines blinking at them. They needed something to believe in. Daniel closed his notebook with deliberate calm. You asked me for data. I'll keep giving it. But understand this. Ranger isn't here for sentiment. He's here because sometimes machines miss what life whispers. And if there's even a chance he hears something first, are you willing to throw that chance away? No one answered. The silence stretched. Dr. Ramirez exhaled, her gaze softening for just a moment. One more week, she said finally. No more. The others nodded, murmuring in reluctant agreement. The meeting broke apart. Papers shuffled. Chairs scraped. One by one, the doctors and nurses filed out, leaving Daniel alone in the sterile room. He sat for a long moment, staring at the surface of the table, the hum of the fluorescent light buzzing in his ears. His hand drifted to the harness draped over the back of the chair beside him. He ran his thumb along the worn leather, scarred and softened by years of use. 4 lives, he whispered, remembering the dust, the blood, the gasp of a child pulled from rubble. You did it then. You'll do it now. His voice dropped even lower, a vow spoken to the absent shepherd, to himself, and maybe even to Sophie in her bed down the hall. You won't fail me now. The hospital at 2 in the morning was unlike any other hour. The day shift clamor had long since faded, replaced by a hush that felt heavier than silence itself. The hallways were dimmed, lit only by strips of cold fluorescent light. In the ICU, where every sound mattered, even the sigh of an air vent could feel like a disturbance. Inside room 12, Sophie Morales lay as she always did, small, unmoving, tethered to the rhythm of machines that hissed and beeped without variance. The ventilator rose and fell, filling her lungs with a borrowed breath. The monitors traced flat, steady lines across black screens. Miguel dozed upright in the chair beside her, head bowed, his hand still wrapped around his daughter's. Eleanor was asleep in the family lounge down the corridor, her voice finally stilled after hours of reading. And in the corner, Ranger waited. The German shepherd had not shifted in hours. His body lay curled tightly against the wall, but his eyes remained open, pupils flicking every so often toward the bed. To a casual glance, he looked asleep. To Daniel, who sat slouched in another chair, notebook balanced on his knee, Ranger was a coiled spring. The clock on the wall struck 2:07. The ventilator hissed. The monitor beeped. Miguel stirred faintly in his sleep. Then, without warning, Ranger exploded into motion. He shot upright, hackles bristling, tail stiff. A guttural bark tore from his throat, echoing against the sterile walls. One, then another, sharp and insistent. His paws scraped against the tile as he lunged forward, teeth flashing as he slammed against the side of Sophie's bed. The sudden chaos jolted Miguel awake. He stumbled to his feet, startled, his chair clattering back. What's happening? The alarms on the machines stayed silent. The monitors blinked calmly, numbers unchanged. Yet Ranger barked again, a deep, feral sound that rattled through the room. Within seconds, 2 nurses rushed in, their sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. "What is going on?" one demanded, eyes darting to the machines. "Are her vitals dropping?" "No alarms," the other answered, already leaning over Sophie to check connections. She glanced at Ranger, frustration flaring. "Get that dog under control." Daniel was already at Ranger's side, fingers gripping the harness. "Easy, Ranger, easy." But the shepherd resisted, his body taut, every muscle straining toward the child on the bed. His bark had shifted now, shorter bursts, followed by low growls that vibrated through his chest. "Mr. Hayes," one nurse snapped. "This is unacceptable. He's disturbing the patient." "There is nothing wrong. Look at the monitors." Daniel's gaze flicked to the screen. Oxygen saturation, stable. Heart rate, steady. Blood pressure, unchanged. To the machines, Sophie was the same as she had always been. Unmoved, silent, lost. But Daniel had spent too many years trusting Ranger in places where machines could not go. He followed the line of the dog's stare, eyes narrowing on Sophie's chest. And there, so small he almost doubted himself, he saw it. Her breath. Not the shallow, mechanical rise the ventilator forced into her. This one was deeper. Just slightly. Barely enough to register on sight, certainly not enough to trip the sensors. But it was there. "Wait," Daniel said, his voice low, urgent. "Look at her chest. Just look." The nurses paused, frowning. One leaned closer, skeptical. "She's on full ventilation support. Any change would trigger an alarm." "I know what I saw." Daniel's hand tightened on Ranger's harness, though his eyes never left the child. "He's not barking at shadows. Watch her." They waited. For a long moment, nothing. The machine's rhythm continued, steady as ever. And then, as if the girl herself wanted to defy the silence, Sophie's chest rose again, fractionally deeper than before, a breath that did not belong to the machine alone. The nurse blinked, startled. That could have been an artifact. Daniel shook his head. No, that was her. Ranger gave one last bark, then fell into a rigid sit beside the bed, his body trembling with the force of held energy. His ears were locked forward, his eyes burning into Sophie's face as though he could wake her awake. Miguel leaned over the bed, eyes wide. "Sophie?" His voice cracked. He clutched her hand tighter, desperate. But the girl remained still, her lashes closed, her body unresponsive. The nurses exchanged uneasy looks. One muttered, "Coincidence," as she scribbled notes onto her chart. The other adjusted Sophie's tubes, her jaw tight. "He can't do this every night," she warned, her tone clipped. "If there's no measurable change, we'll have to remove him." Daniel didn't argue. He only crouched low, eye level with Ranger, his hand resting firm on the dog's shoulder. Ranger's breathing came fast, nostrils flaring, his entire body humming with purpose. "You saw it, didn't you, boy?" Daniel whispered, so softly no one else could hear. "You felt it before anyone did." Ranger didn't move. He didn't have to. His stillness, his unshakable stare, said everything. Daniel straightened slowly, turning back to the bed. He forced himself to write the entry in his notebook, though his hand trembled. 0207 a.m., Ranger barked. The patient's chest rose independently, not recorded by monitor. The nurses left, still muttering, still skeptical. Miguel sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. And the machines returned to their rhythm, indifferent once more. But Daniel's heart beat faster than it had in weeks. He had seen it. The Ranger had seen it first. The machines might not believe, the staff might not care, but he did, because sometimes life whispered so faintly it took more than science to hear it. And tonight, in the silence of 2 a.m., Ranger barked at the whisper of a breath. The second night came with the same oppressive silence, the kind that seemed to press down harder once the clock pushed past midnight. The ICU lights dimmed to their lowest glow, and the hum of machines filled the spaces where human voices used to be. The nurses moved in quieter rhythms, shoes whispering against the tile, as if the very air in the ward demanded reverence. In room 12, Sophie lay as she had the night before, still, pale, her body surrendered to the cold rhythm of the ventilator. Miguel dozed again in his chair, head tilted, his calloused hand wrapped around hers like a rope he refused to let slip. Elena sat across from him, wide awake this time, a book unopened in her lap. She hadn't been able to shake the memory of Ranger's outburst the night before. A single bark in the middle of the ICU was one thing, but that guttural fury, that relentless insistence, still echoed in her chest. And Ranger had not moved from his post. The shepherd sat with his body upright now instead of curled in the corner, as if he were no longer a visitor, but a sentry. His ears twitched at every hiss of oxygen, every faint beep from the monitors. His amber eyes never left Sophie. The clock ticked past 2 a.m. Then, just as before, the silence shattered. Ranger surged to his feet with a snap, barking louder than he had the night before. One bark, then another, then a volley. Sharp, urgent, the kind of sound meant to pull people from danger. His claws scraped against the tile as he paced once in a tight circle, then planted himself by the bed, barking again, head lifted towards Sophie's chest. Miguel jerked awake, heart racing, the chair nearly toppling backward. "What the hell?" he gasped, his voice hoarse with sleep. Elena flinched, clutching Sophie's blanket to her chest. Her eyes darted from the dog to her daughter, panic flaring even though nothing in the room seemed different. Within seconds, 2 nurses rushed in. Their faces carried none of the alarm from the machines, only irritation. "Not again," one muttered under her breath. "Hayes, control him," the other snapped. She moved quickly to the monitors, scanning numbers. "Vitals are steady. Nothing has changed." Daniel was already out of his chair, hand firm on the harness, voice low but urgent. "Ranger, steady. Easy, boy." But the shepherd resisted the command, body taut, bark after bark, echoing down the sterile hall. His tail was stiff, his ears locked forward, every muscle in his frame straining toward the little girl on the bed. "This isn't acceptable," one nurse said sharply, turning on Daniel. "The family needs rest. The ward needs quiet. If he keeps this up, we'll have no choice but to remove him from the program." Another doctor, called by the commotion, appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. His expression was severe, his voice flat. "Therapy dogs are supposed to soothe, not disrupt. If this continues, Hayes, I'll have to recommend pulling him out entirely." Daniel's chest tightened, but he didn't back down. He had seen too much in Ranger's body language to dismiss it. He crouched low beside the shepherd, eyes locking on Sophie's face. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. "Show me." For a moment, nothing. Sophie remained still, her lashes unmoving, the machine filling her lungs with mechanical precision. And then, just like the night before, her chest rose. Not with the ventilator's forced rhythm, but deeper, fractionally different, subtle enough to pass unnoticed. Daniel saw it. His pulse quickened. "Look," he said, his voice firm, desperate. He gestured toward Sophie. "Her chest. It's deeper, just like last night." The doctor shook his head. "Coincidence. The ventilator sometimes forces irregular breaths. That's all." Eleanor's eyes were fixed on her daughter. She leaned forward, holding her breath, her knuckles white where they clutched the blanket. And again, there it was. Another breath, faint but real, different. She caught it this time. Her lips parted. "I saw it," she whispered. The doctor sighed, unimpressed. Wishful thinking, Senora Morales. But Daniel held the line. No. She saw it. And Ranger felt it before either of us. He's not guessing. He's alert. The nurse folded her arms. Even if that's true, Hayes, you can't keep letting this animal bark through the night. Families need peace, not false alarms. You need to make a decision. Daniel turned to face them fully, his voice hardening. Then give me 1 more week. Just 1. If Ranger is wrong, I'll pull him myself. But if he's right, if he's seeing something you don't, then he deserves the chance to prove it. The silence that followed was tense, weighted with unspoken arguments. The doctor exhaled through his nose, clearly unconvinced, but he didn't press further. 1 week, he said finally, his tone reluctant. No more. The nurses muttered their disapproval as they left the room. The doctor followed, shaking his head. Soon, the ward was quiet again, save for the machine's steady hum and Ranger's heavy breathing. Daniel sank back to his chair, pulling his notebook onto his lap. He scribbled furiously. 02:11 a.m. Ranger alert. Patient chest movement observed. Independent of ventilator rhythm. Witnessed by mother. He underlined the last 3 words twice. Eleanor sat in silence, her eyes on her daughter. She still looked uncertain, her face pale with exhaustion, but there was something else now. A flicker. A spark she had not allowed herself in weeks. She glanced at Ranger, who had settled into a rigid sit once more, his eyes still locked on Sophie. You really think he knows? She asked softly, not looking at Daniel, but at the shepherd himself. Daniel closed his notebook. His voice was steady, but his heart was hammering. I don't think, he said quietly. I know. Elena leaned back slowly, her fingers brushing Sophie's hair from her forehead. She wasn't ready to believe it. Not yet. But she had seen it, the small, impossible breath, and the dog had known first. And for the first time since the accident, Elena allowed herself to wonder if hope was more than just a cruel trick of the dark. The surveillance room was colder than the ICU itself, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh, bluish pall over the rows of monitors. Daniel sat alone, the hour crawling past 3 in the morning, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes fixed on the glowing screens. The hospital had agreed to record Ranger's visits as part of the trial. For accountability, the administrators had said. But to Daniel, the footage was more than paperwork. It was the one place he could search for truth when the rest of the staff refused to see it. The video from room 12 flickered on the screen. Sophie's bed filled the frame, her small body still beneath the nest of tubes. Miguel was slumped forward in his chair, head in his hands. Elena sat rigidly on the other side, her lips moving in prayer. And there, just visible in the far corner, Ranger. Daniel pressed play. The scene unfolded exactly as it had the night before. The ICU was quiet, a hum of machines steady as a metronome. Then, at 2:11 a.m., Ranger jolted upright. Daniel leaned closer, watching the shepherd's posture stiffen, his tail snap rigid. The bark followed, sharp, guttural, shattering the silence. Daniel's jaw tightened as he remembered the chaos that followed, the nurses rushing in, their clipped voices insisting there was nothing wrong, the threat of removing Ranger altogether. But now, on the screen, Daniel searched not for people, but for the patient. He slowed the footage, eyes narrowing as he replayed the seconds leading up to Ranger's first bark. Frame by frame, Sophie's chest rose with the ventilator's rhythm. Then, there, a fraction deeper, barely a swell, almost imperceptible. But it was real. The machine didn't flag it, but Ranger had. Daniel froze the frame, his breath caught in his chest. He rewound, played it again. Once more, Sophie's chest rose in that small, stubborn defiance of the ventilator's rhythm. And again, Ranger barked almost immediately after. His heart pounded. He fast-forwarded to the next sequence. Ranger barked again, pacing tight circles beside the bed, muscles quivering. Daniel slowed the footage, eyes scanning Sophie's body. There, her lips parted fractionally. The barest twitch of effort, a whisper of her own breath. The machines remained silent, indifferent, but Ranger had known. Daniel pressed his hands against his face, overcome with the flood of memory. He was back in Haiti, in the rubble of an apartment building leveled by an earthquake. Dust thick in his throat, sweat burning his eyes, listening to silence that seemed endless. The rescue team had nearly called off the search. And then Ranger, young then, pawed at a pile of concrete, barked once, sharp. Everyone dismissed it, until Daniel dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to the debris, and heard the faintest tapping. 4 survivors had come out alive that night. Ranger had never been wrong. Not once. Daniel pulled his hands down, his gaze snapping back to the screen. He rewound, replayed, froze frame after frame. Each time Ranger barked, there was something, small, fleeting, but undeniable. A deeper breath, a flicker in her lips, a shift too subtle for sensors calibrated to measure averages, not whispers. Hope surged through him so suddenly it made his chest ache. "Damn it, boy," he whispered into the empty room, his voice breaking into a smile. "You're seeing what no one else does." He grabbed his notebook, flipping to a fresh page, scribbling notes furiously. 0207, Ranger alert, patient chest rise beyond ventilator rhythm. 0211, alert, observed lip movement, not detected by monitors. He underlined the last phrase 3 times until the paper nearly tore. For the first time in weeks, his hand didn't shake as he wrote. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the frozen frame of Ranger, caught mid-bark, ears forward, eyes blazing with focus. In the image, the shepherd looked less like an intruder in a hospital and more like the rescuer he had always been. Daniel exhaled, long and steady. The staff could call it coincidence. They could argue about sentiment. But he knew. He had the evidence now. Ranger wasn't disrupting. He was detecting. He was working. "Not broken," Daniel murmured, his voice low, reverent. "Not finished. You're still the best partner I've ever had." He closed the notebook gently, pressing his palm against its cover as though sealing the promise inside. Then, softer still, he whispered the words he hadn't dared to say in front of the others, words meant for Ranger alone. "You won't fail me now." In that sterile surveillance room, surrounded by indifferent machines and empty chairs, Daniel allowed himself the one thing he had forbidden for weeks. He let himself believe. Because sometimes, miracles began not with proof on a monitor, but with the bark of an old shepherd who refused to stop listening. The afternoon sun burned outside the hospital walls, a desert blaze that made the air shimmer above the asphalt parking lot. But inside room 12, time moved differently. The lights never changed, the hum of machines never faltered, and the sterile chill pressed against the skin of everyone who lingered there. Miguel sat in his usual place, one hand wrapped around Sophie's, thumb stroking her knuckles in a rhythm as steady as the ventilator hiss. Elena was reading again, though her voice was faint, each word breaking at the edges from fatigue. She read more for herself now than for Sophie. Ritual as survival. Ranger lay on the tile, stretched out, but not asleep. His ears twitched at every sound. The beep of the monitor, the squeak of a nurse's shoe in the hall, the whisper of Elena's page turning. He had been more alert these past 2 nights, ever since the strange, fleeting moments when Sophie's breath had shifted. Daniel, who leaned against the wall with his notebook, noticed it. He could feel the shepherd's energy changing, sharpening, as if something inside him had reawakened. The room was quiet, too quiet. Then, without warning, Ranger rose. His body snapped into motion, as fluid and certain as a soldier moving towards danger. Miguel startled, half rising from his chair. Elena's voice cut off mid-sentence. "Ranger?" Daniel murmured, already on alert. The shepherd strode to the bedside with purpose. He placed both front paws gently on the edge of Sophie's mattress, a violation of his training, something he never did without command. His nose pressed forward, not toward the girl herself, but to the tubing that curved from the ventilator into her airway. His chest rumbled with a low, insistent whine. "What's he doing?" Elena whispered, her voice sharp with fear. Miguel stood, heart thundering, his hand clamping tighter around Sophie's. "Get him down. He's too close." But Daniel saw the focus in Ranger's eyes. Not panic, not confusion, purpose. His hand hovered, unsure whether to pull the dog back or let him lead. Ranger whined again, louder this time, his nose nudging the line of tubing. His paw shifted slightly, as though to point, claws scraping the plastic guardrail. The door burst open. A nurse rushed in, frown etched deep across her face. "What's going on here?" "Hayes! Control your animal." "He's trying to tell us something," Daniel said quickly, stepping closer to the bed. "He's interfering with critical equipment," she snapped, already moving to push Ranger back. "Get him down before he causes damage." But Daniel caught the motion in time. His hand shot out, blocking hers. "Wait, just look where he's pointing." The nurse froze, irritation flaring in her eyes. But Daniel's voice had shifted, no longer pleading, but commanding, the tone of a man who'd given orders in war zones. She hesitated, then bent low, following the line of Ranger's nose. Her eyes fell on the ventilator tube. She frowned, leaned closer. "God," she whispered. Her fingers reached for the connection point where the tube attached to the ventilator. It wobbled beneath her touch, not just loose, barely hanging on. "Call respiratory. Now!" She barked over her shoulder, her voice breaking into panic. Another nurse appeared in the doorway, and in seconds the room filled with movement. Gloves snapped, calls rang out. The ventilator hissed angrily as the connection was stabilized. One nurse checked Sophie's oxygen saturation, still within range, but on the lower side. Another muttered, "If this had slipped free," and didn't finish the thought. Miguel's knees buckled. He dropped into his chair, burying his face against Sophie's arm. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling unbidden as she stared at the dog who had refused to stay silent. Daniel's chest heaved as the weight of it hit him. A few more hours, maybe less, and the tube could have slipped entirely. The machine would not have alarmed right away. Sophie's fragile body might have been starved of oxygen before anyone knew. But Ranger had known. The room slowly quieted as the crisis passed. The nurses finished securing the line, checking and rechecking until they were certain it would not slip again. Respiratory therapy confirmed the fix, left instructions, and filed hurried notes into the system. One nurse lingered at the doorway, shaking her head in disbelief. She glanced once at Ranger, still poised at Sophie's side, eyes locked on the tube, as though guarding it, and then at Daniel. "I don't know how," she admitted softly, "but he saw it before we did." Daniel didn't answer. His throat was too tight. He simply rested a hand on Ranger's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. The shepherd finally lowered himself from the bed, retreating a step, but his gaze never left Sophie. Elena moved toward him slowly, almost hesitant, like approaching something sacred. She knelt, her trembling fingers brushing against the shepherd's fur. "You saved her," she whispered, voice breaking. "You really saved her." Ranger didn't react, not with a wag of his tail or a lick of her hand. He simply sat, still and steady, his presence radiating the quiet certainty of a soldier who had done his duty. Miguel lifted his head, eyes red. His gaze lingered on the dog for a long time. For the first time since Ranger had entered the room, there was no suspicion in his expression, only awe and gratitude he couldn't yet put into words. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand still on Ranger's back. For weeks, he had begged for patience, for trust. Now, in the stillness after the storm, he had proof. Not on paper, not in data points, but in the continued rise and fall of a child's chest. And he whispered under his breath, meant only for the shepherd's ears, "Good boy. You did it." And for the first time in weeks, hope felt less like a fragile illusion and more like something alive. The following morning, the ICU conference room was crowded, the tension thicker than the smell of burnt coffee that clung to the walls. News of the oxygen tube incident had spread quickly, nurses whispering about the German shepherd, who had alerted before anyone noticed, parents of other patients peeking curiously when Ranger was walked down the hall. To Daniel, it was proof of everything he had fought for. To others, it was only an inconvenient anomaly. Dr. Ramirez sat at the head of the table, her posture as rigid as the pressed line of her white coat. Around her gathered a half-circle of physicians and nurses, their folders stacked high with clinical notes. Daniel stood at the opposite end, Ranger at his side, the shepherd calm but alert, amber eyes surveying the room as if he sensed the battle before it began. "Let's be clear," Dr. Ramirez began, her voice crisp, cutting through the low murmur. "The ventilator tube was loose. It is true. Intervention was necessary. But we need to address what happened before that. This animal's behavior in the ICU. Some claim he detected the problem." She let the word hang, skepticism sharp in its edge. "He did," Daniel said firmly, his voice low but steady. "He didn't just detect it. He insisted on it. If we had ignored him, Sophie Morales might not have survived the afternoon." A physician down the table, Dr. Klein, adjusted his glasses, frowning. "Or," he countered, "the tube was already at risk of disconnecting. It was only a matter of time before we noticed. Dogs bark at noises, smells, and shadows. It was a coincidence that he fixated on the tube." Daniel felt heat flare in his chest. Oh, coincidence. The word tasted bitter. He had heard it before, in war zones, when Ranger pawed at rubble no one else thought mattered, until the cries of survivors proved otherwise. "You can call it instinct," Daniel said, his voice rising. His hand rested on Ranger's harness, steadying both the dog and himself. "But I call it survival. He has been trained his whole life to notice the things we don't, things our machines miss. Last night I wasn't lucky. It was the same skill that's pulled human beings out of collapsed buildings and bomb craters. Ranger doesn't guess. He acts. The room bristled. One nurse shifted uncomfortably. Another doctor whispered something under his breath. Doctor. Ramirez's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the weight of authority. Mr. Hayes, anecdotes don't replace evidence. This is a hospital, not a battlefield. We cannot base medical decisions on a dog's instincts. Daniel straightened, shoulders squaring, the old soldier in him rising. With respect, Doctor, I've seen machines fail. I've seen batteries die, screens go dark, monitors miss the sound of a breath because it didn't meet their threshold. But this dog, he pressed his hand against Ranger's back, feeling the steady warmth beneath his palm, has never missed. Not once. You're asking me to treat his presence as symbolic, but yesterday he saved a child's life. If that's coincidence, then I hope coincidence keeps showing up. For a moment, silence held the room. Ranger shifted slightly, his tail brushing against Daniel's leg, his gaze still fixed forward with that soldier's stillness. Unseen behind the half-closed conference room door, Miguel Morales stood in the hallway. He had come looking for Dr. Ramirez to ask about Sophie's latest scans, but the raised voices drew him close. Now he lingered, listening. His heart hammered at Daniel's words. He remembered the moment vividly. Ranger pressing his paws against Sophie's bed, that insistent whine. The panic when the nurse discovered the loose tube. The surge of cold terror at the thought of what could have happened. He had not wanted to believe in the dog, had resisted, even mocked the idea in his mind. But now, standing in the hall, he felt something shift. Daniel's voice carried again, softer now, edged with weariness. I'm not asking you to replace your machines. I'm asking you to acknowledge what you saw. A child is alive today because of him. That deserves recognition. Dr. Klein sighed, shuffling his notes. Recognition, maybe. But protocol doesn't change because of one incident. We must be careful. Miguel's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to storm in, to shout at them that his daughter wasn't an incident, that their hesitation could have cost her life. But he stayed where he was, pressed against the cool wall, his jaw tight. His belief had not yet become words, but it was there now, growing, undeniable. Dr. Ramirez finally spoke, her tone measured. We will continue to observe, but understand, Hayes, if Ranger disrupts patient care, he will be removed. One incident does not rewrite policy. Daniel exhaled, a slow release of tension. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't defeat. His hand pressed against Ranger's neck, grounding himself in the shepherd's steady presence. Then give him the chance. That's all I ask. The meeting dissolved, papers gathered, chairs scraping back. Doctors left in pairs, whispering, some unconvinced, others thoughtful. Ranger remained unmoved, his gaze following them out, then returning to Daniel as if awaiting orders. Daniel bent down, close enough that his voice carried only for Ranger. They can doubt all they want, he murmured, his throat tight. But I know what you did. And so does she. Out in the hallway, Miguel stepped away from the door, his chest heavy, his mind replaying Ranger's sharp whine, the terrifying looseness of the tube, and Daniel's unwavering defense. For the first time since the accident, he felt something besides despair. It wasn't yet hope, but it was the beginning of faith in the shepherd who had refused to be silent. And in that fragile seed of belief, Miguel found himself whispering, almost unconsciously, "Gracias, Ranger." The ICU had settled again into its late afternoon hush. Outside the hospital, the desert sun blazed against the windows, but inside, the light was softer, filtered through blinds, pale and steady. Room 12 smelled faintly of alcohol wipes and fading carnations, the kind of sterile perfume that had come to define the Morales family's days. Elena sat in her usual chair by Sophie's bedside, her hands folded tightly around the edges of a worn children's book. She hadn't opened it yet. For once, the words felt too heavy to speak. Her voice was cracked raw from days of reading, singing, praying, and the silence between sentences had grown longer. She looked at her daughter's still face, at the faint rise and fall of her chest with the ventilator's rhythm, and her heart ached with the helplessness of it all. She had always believed words could save. They had carried her through a life of struggle, given her a career as a teacher, wrapped her child in fairy tales and lullabies. But here, in the sterile weight of the ICU, words fell powerless. Sophie did not stir. The machines did not change. And Elena's voice had begun to feel like a fragile echo swallowed by a void. Her gaze shifted, almost unwillingly, to the far side of the room. Ranger sat there, upright, his posture calm but unwavering, amber eyes fixed on Sophie. For days she had looked at him and seen only indifference. A dog lying still while her daughter wasted away. An animal whose presence was meant to comfort her, but instead reminded her of promises that felt hollow. But since the tube incident, something inside her had shifted. She couldn't erase the image. Ranger pressing his paws onto Sophie's bed, nose buried at the ventilator line, whining with desperate urgency. She had seen the nurse's face when she found the loose connection, and had heard the fear in her voice when she admitted how close it had been. Sophie could have died that afternoon. The thought made Elena's stomach clench, and made her breath hitch in her throat. And the only reason she hadn't was the shepherd. Elena set the book down on the chair beside her. Slowly, hesitantly, she rose to her feet. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move. His gaze stayed on Sophie, as steady as if the machines themselves had appointed him guardian. She crossed the room with cautious steps. It felt strange to approach him. She had fed stray dogs in her neighborhood growing up, and had smiled at service dogs in airports. But this was different. This was personal. This was the creature who had stood between her child and death. When she stopped before him, Ranger lifted his head. His eyes met hers, clear, unblinking, and full of a strange depth that made her throat tighten. He didn't move closer, didn't wag his tail. He simply looked at her, as if waiting for her to decide what this moment meant. Elena's hand trembled as she lifted it. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, hovering in the air, afraid of breaking some invisible line. Then, softly, she lowered her palm to the shepherd's head. His fur was coarser than she expected, thick beneath her fingers, warm with life. She stroked once, twice, her touch tentative. The ranger did not flinch, did not shift away. He remained still, allowing her grief to flow into that simple connection. Her voice came in a whisper, shaky and raw. "Gracias." "Thank you, boy. You saved her." The words cracked on her lips, and her eyes burned with sudden tears. She had been so tired, so certain that nothing could change, and yet here she was, speaking gratitude to a dog who had refused to be silent. Ranger blinked slowly, then leaned just slightly into her hand, the barest motion of acknowledgement. It wasn't affection in the way most dogs gave it, not playful, not exuberant. It was steadier, quieter, A recognition. Elena's shoulders sagged as though a weight had eased, if only slightly. For days she had carried suspicion, even resentment toward the shepherd, resenting the hope he represented when she had none left. But touching him now, feeling his stillness beneath her palm, she realized it wasn't indifference, it was vigilance. He wasn't ignoring Sophie. He was watching, listening, waiting in a way none of them could. She knelt beside him, her hand still stroking his fur, her other reaching back toward Sophie's bed. "She's all I have," Eleanor whispered, the confession falling into the quiet room. "Don't stop watching her. Please." Ranger exhaled through his nose, a sound that was almost a sigh. His gaze flicked briefly toward Elena, then returned to Sophie, unshaken. Daniel, who had been watching quietly from his corner of the room, felt a tightness in his chest loosen. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He only scribbled a note into his book. Elena initiated contact with Ranger. Whispered gratitude. Emotional shift. But in truth, no note could capture what had just passed between them. Elena pressed her forehead briefly against Ranger's shoulder, eyes squeezed shut. "Stay with her," she whispered again. "Stay." For the first time in weeks, she felt she wasn't carrying the vigil alone. Ranger's steady presence filled the silence, bridging the distance between mother and daughter, between despair and hope. And in that fragile moment, a bond was born, not of words or proof, but of quiet gratitude, shared between a grieving mother and the silent dog who refused to look away. The ICU at night had become Daniel's war room. The others left when their shifts ended, slipping back to their homes and their lives. But Daniel remained, his notebook open, his pen steady, his eyes rarely leaving the shepherd lying on the tile. Ranger had changed since the incident with the oxygen tube. He was no longer the silent figure in the corner, dismissed as indifferent. His body was alive with small, precise movements. Movements Daniel knew better than anyone. They weren't random. They weren't noisy. They were signals. Daniel began to write. 22:14. Left ear flicks twice. Sophie exhales slightly deeper. 22:56. Tail stiffens. One paw shift. Her heart rate monitor dips, then rises again. 23:41. Head tilt, nostrils flare. Lip twitch visible on patient. He leaned forward, scribbling quickly, then drew arrows linking the behaviors. It was the same way he had logged Ranger's search and rescue work years ago. The paw scratches against concrete, the insistent whine near broken pipes, the rigid tail at collapsed stairwells. Every movement had meant something then. It meant something now. The machines hummed their flat rhythms, but Daniel was learning to read a second set of data. A living chart made of muscle and instinct. Ranger's body told a story the monitors hadn't been built to hear. Miguel sat in his usual chair, watching quietly. He hadn't said much since overhearing the meeting where Daniel had defended Ranger. But tonight, he leaned forward, studying both the dog and the notebook. "You really believe those scratches and twitches mean something?" Daniel didn't look up. "I don't believe it. I know. He's done this before. Different settings, different dangers, but the language hasn't changed." He tapped the page with his pen. "This is the Ranger's monitor. You just have to learn how to read it." Ranger shifted suddenly, ears pricking forward, body tensing. His nose twitched as he leaned fractionally toward Sophie. Daniel's pen moved at once. 012. Full body alert posture. Sophie's chest expands independently, 3 times in sequence, not captured by machine alarms. Daniel underlined the note twice. His pulse quickened. The pattern was solidifying. Elena, sitting across from them, finally broke her silence. "So you're saying—" "He notices before the machines do?" Daniel nodded, eyes still on the dog. "Not before, beyond. Machines are built to measure thresholds. Ranger doesn't need thresholds. He feels the change the moment it happens." Ranger eased back onto his haunches, still alert, gaze fixed. Daniel reached down, brushing his hand against the shepherd's fur, grounding himself in the warmth beneath it. He could feel the muscle twitching under his palm, vibrating with focus. He flipped back through the notebook, scanning pages filled over the past nights. Every entry, every mark, told the same story. Ranger barked, whined, twitched. Sophie shifted, breathed, twitched in turn. Always subtle, always dismissed by staff, but undeniable when written side by side. The pattern emerged like constellations in the desert night, tiny specks of light that, once connected, revealed something vast and undeniable. Daniel sat back, staring at the pages, his chest rising with something that felt dangerously close to hope. For weeks he had been suffocating under doubt, pressed down by doctors' skepticism, parents' despair, his own fear of failure. But here, in ink and instinct, was proof. He turned the notebook toward Miguel and Elena. "Look, here, and here." "Every time he moves," she responds. "You can see it. It's not a coincidence." Miguel leaned closer, brow furrowed, reading slowly. His rough fingers traced the lines, the arrows, the underlined words. His lips parted as he whispered, almost to himself, "He was right. Every time." Eleanor looked too, her eyes wide, her breath catching when she recognized the notes that matched what she herself had witnessed. The deeper breaths, the lip twitch. Her hand drifted unconsciously toward Ranger, fingertips brushing his fur, as though drawn by something she couldn't name. Daniel's voice softened, carrying a weight of reverence. "This isn't just data. This is Ranger telling us she's still in there. He's hearing her when no one else does." The room was quiet except for the machines, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt charged, alive, threaded with possibility. Daniel wrote one last line in the notebook, slow and deliberate. Conclusion. Ranger is not passive. Ranger is signaling. And the patient responds in ways only he perceives. He closed the notebook, his hand resting on the worn leather cover as though sealing a vow. His eyes lifted to Sophie, pale and still, yet no longer lost. Not with Ranger watching. Not with the signals clear. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to smile. Not the brittle, forced smile of hope against despair, but the fragile, genuine smile of a man beginning to believe that his dream was more than theory. And in the dim light of the ICU, as Ranger sat sentinel at Sophie's bedside, tail twitching with quiet focus, that belief no longer felt like a dream at all. It felt like the beginning of a language finally being heard. The ICU was quieter than usual that night. A rare lull had settled across the ward. No alarms screaming, no frantic calls echoing down the halls. For once, the corridors outside room 12 were still. Inside, Sophie lay unmoving, her small chest rising and falling under the rhythm of the ventilator, the hum of machines filling the air like background music no one wanted to hear. Nurse Marissa Alvarez adjusted Sophie's IV line, her brow furrowed with the same focused frown she wore for every patient. She was good at her job, measured, meticulous, the kind of nurse who relied on data over instinct. She had been skeptical of Ranger from the start, muttering more than once that hospitals were for science, not for dog tricks. Tonight, she had been assigned to Sophie's rotation, and though she didn't say it aloud, she dreaded it. Not because of Sophie, but because of the shepherd in the corner. Ranger sat upright by the bed, his amber eyes steady, his body a coiled wire of concentration. He unnerved her. He didn't wag, didn't fidget, didn't behave the way therapy animals were supposed to behave. He just watched. Daniel leaned against the wall with his notebook, pen poised. He was always there, scribbling down notes that Marissa had never bothered to read. In her mind, they were the scrawlings of a man clinging to hope through a dog's quirks. She didn't begrudge him. It gave him something to do, but she didn't believe it. Not really. It was 1:58 a.m. when Ranger's posture changed. His ears snapped forward, his tail stiffened, and his nose twitched as he leaned closer to the bed. He gave a low, throaty whine, almost a whisper of sound, before letting out a single sharp bark. Marissa flinched, her frown deepening. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone sharp. "We've talked about this. He can't keep disturbing the ward." Daniel didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on Sophie, waiting. "Just watch," he said softly. Marissa huffed but did as asked, mostly to prove a point. She looked at Sophie, expecting nothing. For a long moment, all she saw was the same as always. A pale face, lashes resting against unmoving cheeks, the steady beep of machines confirming the same story. Then it happened, the faintest flicker. Sophie's right eyelid trembled, once, then again, just barely enough to catch the light. It was so subtle, Marissa almost doubted her own eyes. But there it was, a twitch. Not random, not mechanical. Humans. Her breath caught in her throat. She leaned closer, her hands braced against the bed rail. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Daniel's smile was quiet but certain. Ranger saw it first. Marissa turned, her eyes wide. Ranger sat rigid, ears locked forward, his gaze steady on Sophie's face. He hadn't moved since his bark. It was as though he had been waiting for her to prove him right. The nurse swallowed hard. Her skepticism cracked, giving way to something she didn't want to admit. Awe. I thought it was just noise. Just a coincidence. It never is with him, Daniel said gently. This is what he does. Marissa looked back at Sophie, her chest tightening, as the weight of what she'd seen sank in. She had spent her career depending on monitors, on machines that beeped and flashed with clear signals, but none of them had marked this moment. Only the dog had. She exhaled slowly, her voice quieter now, softer. "Your extra monitor," she murmured, glancing at Ranger again. "That's what he is, isn't he? Our extra monitor." Daniel's hand rested on Ranger's back, his eyes warm. "The best one I've ever known." Marissa lingered by the bedside, her gaze shifting between the shepherd and the child. She didn't say another word, but the change in her was visible. The hard edge of skepticism had softened into something else. Respect, maybe even belief. Ranger finally eased down onto the floor, lying close to Sophie's bed, his head on his paws. His job, for now, was done. Marissa stood in the quiet, still shaken by what she had witnessed. She knew she would carry this moment into every shift that followed, because once you saw a machine miss what a dog caught, once you saw a child's eyelid twitch in answer to a bark, skepticism didn't stand quite as tall anymore. And though she would never admit it aloud, not yet, a part of her felt strangely grateful to the shepherd who refused to stop listening. The night was heavy with the kind of silence that makes every small sound carry farther than it should. The distant hum of the air vents, the rhythmic hiss of Sophie's ventilator, the faint squeak of Miguel's chair whenever he shifted, all of it blended into a fragile symphony of waiting. Ranger lay on the floor beside the bed, his head resting between his paws, but his body taut, as if coiled for something no one else could sense. His amber eyes never left Sophie. Daniel sat against the wall with his notebook open on his lap, fatigue pulling at his shoulders but his pen poised, ready. Elena was at the bedside, her hand cradling her daughter's limp fingers, whispering words that sounded more like prayers than stories. Then, at 2:03 a.m., everything changed. Ranger's ears pricked first, the subtle shift that Daniel had come to recognize as his precursor signal. His head lifted, nostrils flaring, body stiffening. A low growl rumbled in his throat, soft, deliberate. And then, with startling force, he barked. One sharp, cutting sound that cracked through the still air like a gunshot. Miguel jolted awake, his chair scraping back. Elena froze, her eyes snapping toward the shepherd. "What is it?" Daniel was already on his feet, his heart pounding. "Watch her," he said quickly. "Look at Sophie." They turned, their eyes riveted on the child, lying beneath a web of tubes and wires. For a long moment, nothing. The machines continued their indifferent hum, their screens unchanged. Then, impossibly, Sophie's hand twitched. It was the faintest of movements, her small fingers curling just barely against Elena's palm. So subtle that anyone else might have dismissed it as reflex. But to Elena, who had held that hand for nearly a month of stillness, it was the universe cracking open. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed her lips against Sophie's knuckles, her tears spilling hot and fast. "She's still there," Elena sobbed, her voice raw, breaking. "My baby's still there." Miguel stood frozen, his mouth opening but no words coming. His chest rose and fell with a force he couldn't contain, and then his hand joined Elena's, wrapping both of theirs around Sophie's tiny fingers. "Mija," his voice fractured. "You're still fighting." Ranger's body remained rigid, ears locked forward, gaze fixed on Sophie, as though he had been waiting for this moment. His tail didn't wag, his posture didn't relax. He only stood his ground, sentinel over a fragile miracle. Daniel's hand shook as he scribbled in his notebook. 0203. Ranger alert, sharp bark. Patient movement observed, right hand twitch, witnessed by both parents. He underlined it 3 times, his pulse racing. The door burst open, Nurse Marissa rushing in, alarmed by the bark. "What's happening?" she demanded, scanning the monitors. But nothing had changed on the screens. Numbers remained steady, flat, clinical. "Look!" Eleanor cried, holding Sophie's hand aloft as though to prove the impossible. She moved. Her hand moved. Marissa hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she leaned closer. For a long moment, doubt lingered. Then Sophie's fingers twitched again, faint but undeniable. Marissa's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her eyes flicked toward Ranger, who remained steadfast at the bedside. For the first time, there was no skepticism in her gaze, only awe. Elena collapsed forward, pressing her forehead against Sophie's arm, her tears soaking into the thin hospital blanket. She whispered again and again through her sobs, "You're still there. You're still there." Miguel stood behind her, his large hands trembling as he stroked his daughter's hair. His eyes glistened, his jaw quivered, but he forced himself to stay upright, to anchor Eleanor when she could no longer hold herself. Daniel exhaled a breath, he hadn't realized he was holding. His eyes burned, though he fought back his own tears. He crouched beside Ranger, resting a hand firmly on the dog's back. "You knew," he whispered. "You knew before any of us." Ranger blinked slowly, his gaze never leaving Sophie. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, a quiet echo of the fight he had always carried. Marissa finally found her voice, shaky but sure. "I'll document this," she said softly, almost reverently. Her first movement, triggered by him. Her eyes shifted to the shepherd. Our extra monitor. The room filled with a silence that wasn't despair anymore. It was fragile, trembling hope, the kind that had been buried deep but refused to die. Elena lifted her head, her face wet with tears, her lips pressed against Sophie's fingers. She looked at Ranger then, her voice shaking but certain. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for hearing her when we couldn't." Ranger lowered himself to the floor, finally releasing a long, steady breath. His body relaxed, but his eyes stayed on the child, as if to say his watch was far from over. Daniel closed his notebook with a trembling hand. For the first time since this trial began, he didn't feel like a man fighting against failure. He felt like a man standing on the edge of something extraordinary. And as Sophie's fingers twitched once more, faint but real, he knew with absolute certainty, Ranger was not guessing. He was listening. The machines hadn't spoken, but a shepherd had. And for the first time in weeks, her family heard life stirring again. The hospital had grown still again, that heavy stillness that comes only after midnight. Soft footsteps echoed faintly in the corridors. Room 12 was half dark, blinds drawn, shadows stretched across the floor. Miguel Morales sat slumped in his chair, Sophie's hand cradled in his. He stroked her fingers absently, remembering when those same hands were sticky with melted ice cream, or tugged him toward playground swings. Now they felt fragile, almost weightless, as though they might break if he held too tight. Across the room, Ranger sat in the corner, amber eyes glowing faintly in the half-light. He was not restless, not asleep, just there, watchful, as if he alone was still keeping guard. Miguel's throat tightened. He glanced toward the door to be sure no one was coming, then pushed himself up, knees stiff with fatigue, and crossed to the shepherd. Ranger didn't move. He simply waited. Miguel dropped heavily to his knees. For a long moment, he could not speak. Then the words came, low and hoarse. "It's my fault." Ranger tilted his head slightly, listening. That night, the crash. She wanted to go out just for a little while. Elena said it was too late, but I said yes. Because I wanted to see her smile. Because I didn't want to be the strict father who always said no. His voice cracked. And now, look at her, lying here. Because of me. His fists clenched, his eyes burned. I was supposed to protect her. That's my only job. And I failed. The silence pressed down. The machines hummed. Sophie's chest rose and fell. And at last, Ranger moved. He leaned forward, slow and deliberate, and rested his muzzle on Miguel's knee. Miguel let out a shuddering breath. He hadn't known how badly he needed that weight, that simple presence. Not judgment, not argument, just a grounding touch. He lifted a trembling hand and laid it on the shepherd's head. "You don't understand," he whispered. "You're just a dog. But somehow, you see her. You hear her. When I can't. When the doctors won't. You knew she was still there. Tears spilled hot down his face. And I hate myself for not knowing first. For not being enough. Ranger's tail flicked once against the floor. His eyes closed, but his head stayed pressed firm against Miguel's knee. Miguel bent forward, his forehead nearly touching the shepherd's. I can't lose her. If she goes, it will be like I never protected anything in my life. For long minutes they stayed that way, man and dog, kneeling beside a child caught between worlds. Miguel's guilt didn't vanish, but the weight loosened just enough to let him breathe again. He pulled back, stroking Ranger's fur. Thank you, he whispered, for not letting her slip away. For standing guard when I couldn't. The shepherd exhaled slowly, pressing a little harder into his knee. Miguel rose stiffly, wiped his face and returned to his chair. He clutched Sophie's hand again, this time carrying with him the faintest seed of trust in the dog who refused to leave their side. The night settled deeper over Sierra Vista Hospital. In room 12, shadows draped the walls, broken only by the soft glow of monitors. Elena Morales sat rigid by Sophie's bed, her fatigue so deep it hollowed her bones. She had not meant to sing, but the memory rose unbidden, the lullaby Sophie once begged for every night. And before she could stop herself, Elena began to hum. The melody was fragile, cracked at the edges, but it carried into the still air. Miguel, across the room, kept his eyes closed, but his thumb brushed gently over Sophie's palm, in time with the tune. From the corner, Ranger stirred. For nights, he had kept his distance, a silent sentinel. But as the lullaby filled the room, he rose. His nails clicked softly against the tile. Elena's voice faltered. She froze, startled, as the shepherd moved closer, step by step, until he stood at Sophie's bedside. He glanced once at Elena, ears pricked, as if asking permission. Something in his eyes stopped her from protesting. She swallowed and kept singing. Ranger placed his paws gently on the rail, then lowered himself to the floor again, pressing his body against the bed frame. He settled with his head just beneath Sophie's limp hand, anchoring himself to her presence. Elena's song wavered, tears filling her eyes. She had grown used to silence, used to lullabies that vanished into the void. But here was a listener, steady, loyal, refusing to let her voice disappear. She reached down, brushing trembling fingers through his fur. He didn't move, only shifted closer to Sophie, his breathing deep and steady. Gracias, she whispered. Thank you for listening to her when I couldn't. And thank you for listening to me now. Miguel opened his eyes slowly, watching his wife bent over the shepherd, her forehead pressed briefly against his neck. For the first time in weeks, the lullaby didn't feel wasted. The song faded into silence. Ranger exhaled a long breath, as if echoing her own. And for a moment, the ICU felt different. Not just a room of machines, but a place where an old lullaby and a dog's quiet devotion could weave a bridge between despair and hope. Sophie didn't stir. Her eyes didn't flutter. But Elena no longer felt alone. The song had found a listener, and that was enough. The hospital was quiet again, lulled into that strange rhythm between night and dawn where time seemed to pause. Ranger lay stretched against Sophie's bed frame, his muzzle near her hand, amber eyes half closed but alert. Elena had finally drifted to sleep, her head resting on the arm of her chair, lips still parted, as though a note of her lullaby lingered on her breath. Miguel sat in the opposite chair, his hand never letting go of Sophie's fingers, his gaze heavy with exhaustion. Daniel stood at the window, notebook tucked under his arm, eyes fixed on the faint reflection of himself against the glass. His posture was stiff, his shoulders rigid, but inside, memories were stirring. Memories he had spent years burying under duty, under science, under the relentless push to prove his program mattered. The soft hum of the machines was the trigger. That rhythm, steady, cold, precise, pulled him back to another hospital, another sterile room, long ago. He had been 12. The memory unfolded in fragments. The smell of antiseptic, the harsh fluorescent lights, the squeak of sneakers against polished tile. His little sister, Clara, only 8 years old, lying in a hospital bed with wires clinging to her tiny body. Pneumonia, they said. Severe. But she was strong, they promised. The machines would keep her safe. Daniel remembered the chair he sat in, too big for his skinny frame, his legs swinging nervously above the floor. He remembered holding Clara's hand, whispering stories from the comics they both loved, about heroes who always arrived in time. She had tried to smile, tried to squeeze his fingers, but the effort was too much. He remembered the beeping. The machines never faltered. They ticked along with clinical indifference, declaring stability even as her breaths grew weaker, shallower. He had leaned close, his ear inches from her lips, and he swore he had heard her whisper something, a sound, a plea, maybe even his name. But when he turned to the nurses, pointing, desperate, they shook their heads. The monitors show no change, they told him. She's fine. She wasn't. Hours later, her chest stilled. The monitors blared only then, too late. By the time the staff rushed in, by the time hands pressed and voices shouted and doors slammed, she was gone. Daniel's small world had ended to the tune of alarms that only screamed after the fact. Now, standing in Sophie's room decades later, Daniel pressed a hand against the window glass, his reflection blurred by moisture in his eyes. Ranger's soft exhale filled the silence behind him, a reminder of the present. Yet the weight of the past pressed just as hard. He whispered into the stillness, as though speaking to the ghost of his sister. I should have fought harder. I should have trusted what I saw, what I heard, not the machines. His throat tightened. He closed his eyes and saw Clara's pale face, her lips moving faintly with words no one else had believed. He had promised himself, standing outside that hospital years later, that no other family would lose a child because people trusted machines more than the subtle signs of life. That promise had become his obsession. It had driven him through the military, through years of training dogs like Ranger, to listen for what no one else could hear. The faintest vibrations, the smallest breath, the nearly invisible flicker of life. And when war ended, when rubble was no longer his battlefield, he turned to hospitals. Because he knew, if a dog like Ranger had been there for Clara, she might have been heard. She might have been saved. He turned back towards Sophie's bed. The parallels were almost unbearable. A little girl, the same age Clara had been, trapped between silence and survival. Machines blinking their steady rhythm, declaring stability. Parents are exhausted and praying. And a shepherd, his shepherd, listening in ways no machine ever could. Daniel crossed the room and crouched beside Ranger, pressing his forehead lightly against the dog's neck. His voice was hoarse, almost broken. This is why we're here, boy. This is why I built it all. For her. for every child who whispers too softly for a machine to hear. Ranger exhaled, slow and steady, leaning into Daniel's touch. Miguel stirred across the bed, his tired eyes opening just enough to catch the sight of Daniel bent against the shepherd, whispering words that seemed to carry decades of grief. He said nothing, didn't intrude. But in that silence, Miguel understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't just a program for Daniel. It was a vow born of loss. Daniel lifted his head, his eyes wet, but burning with quiet fire. He whispered one last time, the words more to himself than to anyone else. "We won't let it happen again." Then he picked up his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and began writing with renewed clarity, his pen moving fast and certain. The signals, the patterns, the moments, every detail mattered, because this wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about redemption. And as Sophie slept on, her fingers faintly twitching once against her mother's palm, Daniel felt the old wound of his childhood ache less. Not because it had healed, but because for the first time in years, he believed he was finally honoring the promise he had made to Clara. The clock struck midnight, its tick barely audible against the steady rhythm of the ICU. Room 12 lay in shadow, monitors painting faint green and blue across the walls. Sophie had lain here for 5 weeks, silent, pale, breathing only with the machines. Her parents were constant fixtures. Miguel slumped at the rail, hand clasped around his daughters. Elena curled in a chair, blanket across her shoulders. But Ranger wasn't sleeping. The old German shepherd lay pressed against Sophie's bed, amber eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Every rise of her chest, every twitch, he recorded in silence. At 12 o'clock, his body stiffened. His ears pricked, nostrils flared, and a low, urgent whine broke the silence. Daniel was there within seconds. He knew Ranger's language now. This was no routine bark. Crouching beside him, he whispered, "What is it, boy?" The shepherd's gaze locked on Sophie. Daniel followed, and at first saw nothing. Then Sophie's eyelids fluttered, once, twice. His breath caught. "Oh my God!" He slammed the call button. "Nurse, now!" Miguel jolted upright. "What's happening?" "Her eyes," Daniel whispered. "She's opening her eyes." Elena stumbled forward as Sophie's lashes fluttered again, opening just enough to reveal a glimmer of life. The door burst open, nurses rushing in. Silence fell as everyone watched. Sophie blinked, unfocused, as if lost in fog, but awake. Elena dropped to her knees, sobbing. "Mi niña." Miguel pressed his hands to his mouth, shoulders shaking. Nurse Marissa whispered, eyes wet, "She's responding. She's really responding." Daniel clutched Ranger's fur, tears blurring his vision. The shepherd barked once, sharp and certain, then laid his muzzle against the bed as if punctuating the moment. "I told you." The doctor arrived minutes later, breathless, ordering tests, but nothing could erase what they had witnessed. After 5 silent weeks, a child had opened her eyes, and Ranger had known first. By dawn, whispers had spread through the ICU. Nurses spoke in hushed awe. Parents in nearby rooms peeked through the glass. Inside, Eleanor hadn't released Sophie's hand since. Miguel hovered, tense, afraid the spell might break. Sophie's gaze drifted between them, heavy, fogged, but present. "Come on, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, voice trembling. Sophie's lips parted, closed, parted again. A faint rasp emerged, fragile as a sigh. "Mom." The room froze. Elena gasped, collapsing over her daughter's hand, laughter and sobs spilling together. Miguel pressed his face into Sophie's hair, whispering, "Mija, you came back to us." Nurses at the door covered their mouths. Daniel stood stunned, notebook forgotten, tears unchecked. Ranger lifted his head, tail wagging once, slow and deliberate. His eyes never left Sophie, as though this had been his mission all along. The sound of monitors faded beneath Elena's sobs, Miguel's broken laughter, the crack in Daniel's voice. For the first time in weeks, the ICU wasn't ruled by machines. It was filled with the fragile, undeniable voice of a child calling for her mother. By sunrise, the story had escaped. The dog who saved a coma girl. A miracle in room 12. Reporters gathered outside the hospital. Vans lined the street, cameras angled skyward. Inside, Daniel bristled. His program had been born from grief, built on discipline and proof. He wanted Sophie's healing to unfold in peace, not as spectacle. But by mid-morning, the storm breached the doors. Nurse Marissa entered hesitantly. "Daniel, they want you downstairs. Reporters. They heard about Sophie. And Ranger." Elena stiffened. "No. Sophie isn't ready." Miguel stepped forward, voice hard. "This is private." Daniel nodded. "Tell them no. The family needs peace." But Marissa's face was uneasy. "The hospital thinks it's good publicity. They're already talking about funding, recognition." Once those words would have meant everything to Daniel. Now they felt dangerous. Still, by afternoon, camera crews had been ushered in under the guise of human interest. Flashes lit the hallway. Miguel tried to block them. Elena shielded her daughter. But the tide was unstoppable. Finally, Daniel stepped forward, his voice cutting through. "Enough. She's still fighting to breathe. You don't get to turn her into a headline." The reporters pivoted. "Are you Daniel Hayes, founder of the therapy dog program?" The question weighed heavy. He could deny it, protect the fragile peace. Or he could face the storm, give Ranger's gift the recognition it deserved. He thought of Clara, his sister, whose voice he'd once believed in when no one else had. He exhaled. "Yes, I'm Daniel Hayes, and this is Ranger." The cameras surged. Lights flooded his face. He steadied his voice. "You can call it a miracle if you want. But this isn't magic. This is instinct and training. Machines listen for thresholds. Dogs like Ranger listen for life. And last night, he heard Sophie fighting her way back." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Miguel glanced at Ranger, lying calm beside Sophie's bed, head near her hand, and understood. The storm outside grew louder. Headlines, flashes, whispers. But within room 12, Ranger wagged his tail once, slow and certain, before closing his eyes. Daniel realized then the story had left their control, but maybe that was the point. Maybe this was how hope spread, on the voice of a little girl and the bark of a dog who refused to give up. The ICU had been Sophie's world for weeks. When the day came to move her to rehabilitation, it felt almost unreal. The halls here were softer, painted in warm colors, the air filled with children's voices instead of constant machines. Sophie sat in a wheelchair, thin and fragile beneath a blanket, but her eyes were open now, searching. Ranger walked at her side, harness slack, his pace matched to hers. He had not left her since the night she whispered, "Mom." The therapy room was bright, filled with sunlight and quiet equipment. Dr. Alvarez, the therapist, knelt before her. "Today we try small things, just one step at a time." Sophie whispered her first word outside the ICU. "Okay." Elena gasped. Miguel pressed his hand to his mouth. Even Daniel's pen shook as he wrote, "First voluntary verbal response in rehab." Ranger wagged his tail once, anchoring the moment. The session began with a plastic spoon. Sophie's fingers trembled, the utensil slipping twice before settling in her grip. Elena bent close, coaxing softly. "Like at home, mi amor. Just scoop." Sophie's hand shook violently, but the spoon lifted an inch, then two. Ranger let out a low whine, eyes fixed on her. The spoon stayed upright. Sophie glanced at him, lips curling into the faintest smile. "See?" she whispered. Elena broke into sobbing laughter. Miguel's shoulders shook, and Ranger lowered his head gently onto Sophie's lap, as though steadying her hand with his presence. That first victory became the pattern, stacking blocks, whispering single words. Yes, no, again. Each attempt drained her, sweat beading on her forehead, but every time her eyes searched for Ranger, finding strength in his unblinking loyalty. Soon, she was not the only one. Word spread through the ward, the dog who saved the coma girl. One morning, a 6-year-old named Lily, still wobbly from spinal surgery, shuffled forward on braced legs. Ranger lifted his head, amber eyes meeting hers. She placed a trembling hand on his fur, leaning into him. Her giggle filled the room. Sophie, watching, laughed too. A thin rasp, but real. "He's helping," she whispered. "Not just me." From then on, more children came. A burn victim tracing scars against Ranger's coat. A teenager resting her head on his side between stretches. Parents watched in astonishment. Nurses began calling him our fourth therapist. The ward changed. Where once there was fear, now there was laughter. Small, fragile, but alive. Through it all, Sophie pushed forward. Each day, the words came easier. Each day, she smiled more, because she saw Ranger healing others too. But the hardest moment came not with therapy equipment, but with words. One afternoon, Sophie gripped a soft rubber ball, trying to squeeze. Miguel knelt beside her, guiding her hand. "Eso, mija. Just a little longer." Her fingers quivered, then held, 3 full seconds before the ball slipped away. Miguel caught her hand before it fell. "You did it. You really did it." Sophie opened her eyes, voice hoarse. "Don't let go, puppy." The words pierced him. His chest broke open. He bowed over their joined hands, tears spilling. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he whispered. "Sorry I let you ride with me that night. Sorry I didn't protect you. I gave you joy, and instead, I gave you this. I didn't deserve for you to come back." His shoulders shook under the weight. For a long moment, silence pressed in. The shuffle of therapists, the hum of vents, Ranger's steady breathing. Then Sophie squeezed his hand. Weak, faint, but unmistakable. Her tired gaze locked onto his. "It's your fault." Miguel broke. He collapsed forward, sobbing openly. Elena covered her face, tears streaming. Ranger rose, padded closer, and nudged Miguel's arm with his nose. His amber eyes met the father's, unblinking, as if echoing Sophie's words. Forgiveness is not earned, it is given. Miguel buried his hand in Ranger's fur. "Gracias," he whispered, "for watching her when I couldn't, for not letting me drown in this guilt." Ranger settled his head in Sophie's lap. Her weak fingers stroked his fur, her smile faint but certain. For the first time since the crash, Miguel felt release, not the erasure of guilt, but the easing of its grip. His daughter had forgiven him, the shepherd had affirmed it, and perhaps, at last, he could forgive himself. Elena slipped an arm around his shoulders. Together, they looked at Sophie, alive, awake, fighting. Miguel whispered again, steadier now, Nunca, mija. I'll never let you down again. Sophie clutched his hand tighter, her pale face lit by a fragile smile. And Ranger, faithful as ever, wagged his tail once, quiet affirmation that the hardest climb had begun, but they would not climb it alone. The clock struck midnight, its tick nearly lost beneath the mechanical rhythm of the ICU. Room 12 lay in shadow, monitors glowing faint green across the walls. Sophie Morales had been here for 5 weeks, silent, pale, breathing only because machines did the work for her. Her parents had become part of the room itself. Miguel slumped at the bed rail, hand locked around his daughter's. Elena curled in a chair, blanket across her shoulders, lips parted in shallow sleep. But Ranger wasn't sleeping. The German shepherd pressed against Sophie's bed, amber eyes open, cataloguing every breath. At 12 and truck, his body stiffened. His ears pricked, his nostrils flared, and a low, urgent whine built in his throat. Daniel Hayes burst through the door. He knew Ranger's language by now. This wasn't routine. Crouching beside him, he whispered, "What is it, boy?" The shepherd's gaze was fixed on Sophie. Daniel turned. At first, nothing. Then, her eyelids fluttered. Once, twice. His breath caught. "Oh my God!" He slammed the call button. "Nurse! In here!" Miguel jolted awake. "What's happening?" Daniel's voice shook. "Her eyes. She's opening her eyes." Elena stumbled forward as Sophie's lashes trembled again, opening just enough to reveal a glimmer of life. The room froze. The machines beeped on indifferently, but no one looked at them now. Sophie blinked, unfocused, lost, but awake. Elena collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "Mi niña." Miguel pressed both hands to his mouth, shoulders shaking. Nurse Marissa whispered, eyes wet. "She's responding. She's really responding." Daniel clutched Ranger's fur, tears blurring his vision. The shepherd barked once, short, certain, then lowered his head to the mattress. "I told you." Minutes later, the doctor arrived, calling for tests. But nothing could erase what they had all seen. After weeks of silence, Sophie had opened her eyes, and Ranger had known first. By dawn, whispers spread. Parents in nearby rooms peeked through the glass. Nurses spoke in hushed awe. Inside room 12, Eleanor hadn't released her daughter's hand since. Sophie's gaze drifted between them, heavy but alive. Her lips parted, closed, parted again. "Come on, sweetheart," Elena whispered. Then, a faint rasp, fragile as a sigh. "Mom." The world stopped. Elena collapsed over Sophie's hand, laughter and sobs tangling. Miguel buried his face in her hair. Nurses at the door covered their mouths. Daniel stood stunned, notebook forgotten. Ranger wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, eyes locked on Sophie. The ICU was no longer ruled by machines. It was filled with the voice of a child calling her mother. Weeks later, Sophie was wheeled into the rehabilitation wing. The halls here were softer, painted in warm colors. Her frame was fragile, but her eyes searched. Ranger walked at her side, harness slack. His pace matched to hers. He had not left her since that night. The therapy room was bright, lined with mats and parallel bars. Dr. Alvarez knelt before Sophie, her voice kind. Today, small steps, one at a time. Sophie whispered her first word outside the ICU. Okay. Daniel scribbled furiously. First voluntary verbal response, in rehab. Ranger wagged his tail once. The session began with a spoon. Sophie's weak fingers trembled, dropping it twice before clinging to the handle. Elena bent close, whispering encouragement. Slowly the spoon lifted. An inch, then two. Sophie's lips curled faintly. See? Eleanor laughed and sobbed all at once. Ranger lowered his head onto Sophie's lap, anchoring her hand with his presence. That was the pattern, stacking blocks, whispering yes, no, again. Each attempt drained her, sweat beading on her forehead. But every time her eyes sought Ranger, finding strength in his unblinking loyalty. Soon, she was not the only one. Word spread, the dog who saved the coma girl. Other children drifted toward him. A girl with braces leaned on his side for balance. A burn victim traced his scars into Ranger's fur. A teenager rested against him, whispering secrets only he would hear. The Ranger gave them stillness, warmth, and presence. Nurses began calling him our fourth therapist. The ward, once heavy with fear, filled with laughter. Thin, fragile, but alive. Watching it unfold, Sophie whispered to her mother, "He didn't just save me. He saved all of us." But the hardest moment came not with therapy, but with words. One afternoon, Sophie gripped a soft ball, her hand trembling. Miguel knelt beside her. "Eso, mija. Just a little longer." She held the squeeze for 3 seconds before collapsing. "You did it," he whispered. Her hoarse reply, "Don't let go, puppy." The words pierced him. His chest broke. He bowed over her hand, tears spilling. "I'm sorry, Sophie. Sorry I let you ride with me that night. Sorry I didn't protect you. I gave you joy. And instead, I gave you this." His voice cracked. "I didn't deserve for you to come back." Silence pressed in. Then Sophie squeezed his hand. Weak, faint, but real. Her tired gaze locked onto his. "It's not. It's your fault." Miguel collapsed, sobbing openly. Elena covered her face, her tears streaming. Ranger padded forward, nudging Miguel's arm with his nose. His amber eyes seemed to echo Sophie's words. "Forgiveness isn't earned. It's given." Miguel buried his hand in Ranger's fur. "Gracias," he whispered. Sophie stroked the dog's head, smiling faintly. For the first time since the crash, Miguel felt released. His daughter had forgiven him, and maybe, at last, he could forgive himself. The auditorium at Sierra Vista Hospital had never been so full. Reporters, doctors, parents, all waiting for the miracle of Room 12. Daniel Hayes stood at the podium, Ranger at his side. Sophie Morales was silent for weeks. The machines told us nothing had changed. But the Ranger saw what we didn't. Her fight to come back. He set aside his notes, speaking from the gut. Machines hear beeps. Dogs hear life. A hush swept the room. Because of him, Sophie is awake. Because of him, she speaks. Ranger has proven what I've always believed, that dogs can bridge the gap between science and instinct, between silence and survival. Sophie sat in the front row, eyes shining at Ranger. Elena wept openly. Miguel's jaw trembled, but he nodded, steadying her shoulder. Applause spread, hesitant at first, then swelling. It wasn't for Daniel. It was for the shepherd lying calm at his feet. In the weeks after, the headlines faded. What remained was community. Children once silent returned with gifts. Biscuits tucked in paper bags, drawings of Ranger beneath trees surrounded by laughter. Parents whispered thanks, hands pressed to his fur as though to a talisman. The word changed. Where once there was fear, now there was laughter, small but real. Sophie, always at the center, smiled most when she saw it. "He didn't just save me," she whispered. "He saved all of us." By spring, her favorite place was the hospital garden. Beneath a mesquite tree, she sat in her wheelchair with a battered dinosaur book. Her voice, still raspy, carried each word carefully. Triceratops, had 3 horns. She giggled, looking at Ranger stretched across the grass. "You'd scare one off, wouldn't you?" Ranger huffed softly, tail sweeping once. Sophie laughed. Elena watched from a bench, knitting forgotten. Miguel stood behind her, his arm draped across her shoulders, and Daniel stood near the path, notebook closed. He thought of Clara, his sister, whose whispers had gone unheard. He thought of the years spent chasing proof, and he realized this was it. Not the press conference, not the headlines, but a girl reading in the sunlight, alive because a shepherd had listened. Sophie finished a passage and sighed, resting her hand on Ranger's head. "Thanks for listening." The shepherd wagged his tail once, slow and steady, before settling his head against her knee. Under the mesquite tree, Sophie Morales was not just a patient. She was a child again, reading stories to her dog. And Daniel knew he would carry that image with him for the rest of his life. The picture of silence broken, of life heard, of peace at last. The hospital was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that felt earned, not heavy. The reporters were gone, the hallways calmer, the storm of attention finally fading. In his small office near the pediatric wing, Daniel Hayes sat at his desk with the blinds half drawn. The desert sun slipped low, painting the sky in amber streaks. His notebook lay open, filled with weeks of observations, dates, times, every bark, twitch or flicker Ranger had caught before anyone else. Tonight his pen moved slower. This wasn't about data anymore. It was about closing a circle. He wrote, "The program is validated. Ranger has proven what machines alone could not. But beyond validation, beyond data, what we found here was something science can only measure so far. The rest belongs to faith. Faith in instincts, in loyalty, in bonds that cannot be charted." The words felt final. Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes. His mind wandered, not to the press conference or the reports waiting, but to the moments stitched into this journey. Ranger, barking in room 12, startling everyone until Sophie's chest drew a deeper breath. The oxygen tube slipping loose, discovered only because Ranger pressed his nose against the ventilator line. Eleanor's cracked lullaby drawing Ranger closer to Sophie's bed, as if the music called him. Miguel's guilty confession answered only by the shepherd's silent muzzle on his knee. And that night, when Sophie's eyelids fluttered open, machines still blind, but Ranger already whimpering, pulling Daniel into the room just in time to see the miracle. Memory after memory, bark, twitch, whisper, word. Daniel stood and walked to the window. The desert horizon burned orange and violet, reminding him of other fields, battlefields where he once stood, of promises made over graves he could not forget. And then, as always, his sister's face rose. Clara, her body in a hospital bed years ago, her lips whispering words no one else believed. He remembered the helplessness, the vow he had made then. One day, someone would listen. Now, watching Ranger lying at Sophie's feet, he whispered toward the glass. "We did it, Clara." She was heard. Behind him, Ranger stirred, padding across the floor to rest his head against Daniel's thigh. Daniel laid a hand in the thick fur. "You were more than proof," he murmured. "You were her bridge. You were mine, too." He returned to his notebook, writing on the final page. "This program will continue, but its foundation is not science alone. Its foundation is faith. Faith in listening, faith in connection, faith in the quiet signals that demand we pay attention. Ranger has taught us that silence is never empty. It is filled with life waiting to be heard." He closed the notebook. For the first time in decades, the weight in his chest eased, not gone, but lighter. Clara's whispers had not been lost after all. They had carried forward through him, through Ranger, into Sophie's awakening. That same night, Sophie Morales lay sleeping in room 12. The wires were gone now. The fortress of machines had been dismantled. What remained was only a bed, clean sheets, a chair by the window, and sunlight waiting for morning. On the floor, Ranger stretched long across the cool tile, his body pressed close to Sophie's bed. His eyes stayed open, steady amber pools fixed on the girl who had fought her way back from silence. Eleanor sat nearby, watching them both. This vigil felt different. It wasn't anxiety keeping her awake. It was awe. She looked at Ranger, the dog who had been more than companion, more than therapy. He had been sentinel, bridge, guardian of their hope. She rose, kissed Sophie's forehead, then crouched beside Ranger. He lifted his head, but didn't move. His eyes met hers, steady and unblinking. Eleanor brushed her trembling hand through his fur, then whispered words only for him. "You're family now." Her forehead pressed against his neck. Tears slipped free. Ranger exhaled a long breath, as if answering her vow. From the doorway, Miguel watched silently, Sophie's discharge papers in his hand. He crossed the room, laid a hand on his wife's shoulder, and whispered, "She's right. He belongs with us now." Elena's voice broke. "I don't know how to say goodbye to him." "Maybe we don't have to," Miguel answered. The shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor. His gaze never left Sophie. Daniel stood outside the room, listening. Pride and sorrow tightened his chest. He had brought Ranger as proof of a program, but Ranger had become something more, part of a family's survival. Perhaps this was always where he was meant to be. Hours passed. Near dawn, Sophie stirred, her small hand slipping off the blanket, dangling toward the floor. Ranger lifted his muzzle beneath it, cradling it gently. He stayed that way all night. When Sophie's eyes opened, she saw him there, holding her hand. Her lips curved into a tired smile. "Stay," she whispered. Ranger blinked slowly, the canine version of a promise. He pressed closer. Sophie drifted back to sleep. The morning of Sophie's discharge, the desert sky blazed with rose and gold. Sierra Vista Hospital, which had held so much silence, now seemed to hum with beginnings. In the lobby, Sophie sat in her wheelchair, blanket across her legs, her eyes bright with wonder. Ranger stood poised beside her, his harness gleaming, his amber eyes flicking from Sophie to the doors ahead. Miguel and Elena flanked her, faces lined with exhaustion, but glowing with gratitude. Daniel stood a few steps back, notebook tucked under his arm, his gaze softer than it had ever been. The doors opened. Outside, the desert morning stretched wide. Sophie's breath caught. For the first time in months, she wasn't staring at ceiling tiles. She was looking at the sky. "Ready, mija?" Miguel asked. Sophie's voice was faint but sure. "Ready." The wheelchair rolled forward. Ranger walked close, shoulder brushing the wheel, pace matched perfectly to hers. Step by step, they crossed the threshold into sunlight. Sophie closed her eyes, breathing deep. Then, with Miguel steadying her, she pushed herself up, fragile, trembling, but she stood. Ranger shifted, bracing beside her. Sophie laid her hand on his back, leaned into his strength, and took one step, then another. Behind them, Elena pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling. Miguel's arm wrapped around her shoulders. "She's walking," he whispered. Daniel watched, throat tight. He had dreamed of proving his program, but the true proof was here. A child walking into sunlight, guided by a dog who had refused to give up. At the walkway's edge, Sophie stopped. She looked toward the horizon and whispered, "We made it." Ranger wagged his tail once, lifting his head higher, as if agreeing. The desert wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage, brushing Sophie's hair and ruffling Ranger's fur. In that fragile silence, the truth of their journey spoke for itself. Sometimes, the world doesn't need more machines. It needs a dog who listens. The sun broke fully over the horizon then, spilling gold across sand, sky, and the small figure of a girl walking home with her shepherd. And for the first time in a long time, everything felt possible again. Sometimes, stories like Sophie and Ranger's remind us of something simple but profound, that love between a person and a dog isn't measured in commands or tricks, but in quiet moments of trust. A German shepherd's loyalty runs deep, and it's in those silent gestures, a nudge of the muzzle, a watchful eye at night, that we see how much they truly carry us through life's hardest hours. If you have a dog of your own, you already know what I mean. They aren't just pets. They're family, companions who listen in ways no machine ever could. And if you'd like to explore something that might bring you even closer to your dog, there's a resource I've found helpful. I'll leave the link here only if you're curious. Take it as a gentle suggestion from one dog lover to another. Because in the end, what matters most isn't what we teach our dogs, but what they quietly teach us about loyalty, patience, and love that never lets go.